Hello, and welcome to today's Here's to Your Health podcast. I'm Don Lintzman, your host. My guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen. Heather is the Chief Quality and Ancillary Services Officer here at CCMH. And Heather, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Don.
We're going to talk about the recent, ongoing flu, RSV, and coronavirus season. You would like to think by the time you get to this stage of the game in late March that you would imagine that a lot of that would be by the boards and we'd be looking forward to a great spring. But unfortunately, I don't think that's true.
That's not true. You hope, like you say, by the time spring comes around that we don't have to worry about this stuff anymore. But truly for us, the flu season typically peaks in February, and we start, see it peak in February, goes into March, and we've had flu cases into June. So, like you said, it's continuous.
Yeah, and looking at the state data today, it's kind of interesting that it certainly looks like a lot of the RSV and coronavirus, the COVID, has peaked for the year, but flu has not.
Right. Yeah, we are still seeing flu. We still see a smattering of COVID here and there, but definitely not like it was in the wintertime. But flu it peaks for us January, February, and we have that peak and it stays here for a little while. And I know a lot of people think the flu season is October to March, but it doesn't end with March. Like I said before, we've gone into June.
Yeah, so there's two things about the flu season, and then we're going to talk about flu first, and then we're going to come back to the other two topics for today. What's interesting to me about the flu data is the fact that what we saw a late start this year to flu, but once it got rolling, it really got rolling, and it started out with influenza A,
right?
And now it looks like influenza A is beginning to wane, but influenza B is really taking off.
We started seeing some flu in December, which is typical. We typically see, this kind of a little bit of start of it. You got Christmas in there, and people have been gathering for holidays, but it's really February where it starts to peak, and people are getting tired of it by March, and they want it over with. They want it, and we don't have to protect ourselves anymore. But it really does. It lasts longer than you think.
And what's interesting to me about all of this is that when you take a look at the flu, and you realize that immunization is like any other immunization. It doesn't last forever. It might last 90 to 120 days. In other words, 3 to 4 months. I mean, if you got your flu shot in October, it probably your immunization quality goes down over that next 90 to 120 days. Even if you got the shot, you might be at risk for it now, just based off of the fact that your immunity has started to go away.
That's right. The flu shot, any shot, it's not 100%. However, it does when you have a flu shot, and if you get the flu after you've had the flu shot, the flu typically isn't as severe as it is if you haven't had a flu shot. And that's something that I noticed this year. We track our flu shots that we give. The vast majority of the influenza that we've had come through they haven't had a flu shot. So that in itself, I think, speaks volumes. But you're right, when you get the flu shot, it takes about 2 weeks for you to build up that immunity. But that's why it's a seasonal vaccine, because it does. The immunity kind of wanes over a period of time.
My guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen. Heather is the Chief Quality and Ancillary Services Officer here at CCMH. We're talking about flu and RSV and coronavirus. But before we move away from the flu, a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. Looking at the data, it certainly appears that we've had a significant increase in flu deaths this year in Iowa, about a 25% increase over a typical year. Is there any particular line that you can draw between not getting the flu vaccine and all of the fatalities that we've seen this year?
The one thing that sticks out to me is our influenza vaccination rates. Since in 2020, it seemed like everybody got a flu vaccination because we were worried about COVID at the time, and everybody got a flu vaccination. But we have seen our vaccination rates just kind of dwindle down. And this year, since I've been at the hospital, in general, this is the lowest I've seen our influenza vaccination rates. So whether that has a correlation or a tie, I don't know for certain, but it's certainly something that sticks in my head.
And I would agree with you. I think that there is always that that fatigue factor that comes, and obviously coming out of COVID where everybody got shots and a lot of people didn't get 1 or 2, they got 4 or 5. After a while you look at that and you go, well, it's all the same. It's not. Right. It's not. I mean, the flu shot is a totally different beast than the coronavirus shot is, but that is just interesting to me that we see this increase in mortality this year. And probably in a very reasonable way can draw the line back to the fact that people just didn't get flu shots, and they really need to do that.
That's right. And we did have more admissions to the hospital this year than what we've typically have seen in the past with influenza. So, sometimes you got to draw your own conclusions.
It makes sense, though.
Yeah.
It makes sense. My guest on the podcast today is Heather Rasmussen. Heather is the Chief Quality and Ancillary Services Officer here at CCMH. We're talking about flu, RSV, and coronavirus. Thought maybe we'd be to the end of that season by now, but we're not. And we're looking now, we're at the beginning of spring, and we're looking into the rest of spring on into summer. And it looks like some of this is going to hang around for a while. Now, the good thing is, for all of the hype about COVID and coronavirus this year, it turns out that was not as much of a thing as people thought it might be.
That's right. We every week I get some information from the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services about influenza and COVID. Right now, influenza is at moderate and COVID is low. And COVID's been low for a little while now. Granted, we've had some admissions, but it definitely wasn't the beast that I think everybody thought it would be.
Yeah, just briefly on COVID, it looks from the Iowa data like there was a spike last October, and then one right around Christmas when my wife actually had COVID. And since then, it's fallen off pretty dramatically. It is one of those respiratory diseases that looks like it peaks about twice a year, once in the fall, once in the winter, and then it kind of evens itself out for the rest of the year. Now, RSV, on the other hand, is definitely a wintertime thing. And we saw a huge spike at the beginning of winter, but since then it's kind of trailed off a little bit.
That's right. And this year was, we did see some RSV admissions, and we saw some adult RSV admissions, which, typically is not what you see. Obviously, RSV, everybody says it's a little kid disease, and that's right. But it also can hit our older population, and that's kind of what we saw this year, is that it was hitting people 65 and older and causing them to have to be admitted to the hospital.
I think the thing that always strikes me about the conversations that we have about this, because I'm pretty passionate about this particular aspect, because I think it's so highly preventable. I mean, I think there's so many things we can do to protect ourselves from these respiratory diseases, and yet it seems like we never learn our lesson. We continue to do the same things over and over and over again. Yeah. So let's just, for a second, before we move on to the vaccination part of it, because that's the part that I really get excited about, let's talk a little bit about what we can do today to protect ourselves, because it's so simple.
It is. It's a hand hygiene. Washing your hands is easy to do. Everybody knows how to do it. We just need to be cognizant and wash our hands. Respiratory hygiene. If you have a sneeze or a cough into the curve of your elbow. If you cough into a tissue, throw that tissue away and wash your hands. I love seeing little toddlers when they cough or sneeze. They've been taught they cough into their elbow, and I'm like, good for you. Stay at home if you're sick. Don't go to work and infect everybody else.
And that just seems to make some sense, right?
Exactly. We just need to be reminded that we ourselves can do things to protect others around us.
Absolutely. We could be a little bit more vigilant. Heather Rasmussen is my guest on the podcast today. She's the Chief Quality and Ancillary Services Officer here at CCMH. We're talking about flu, RSV, and COVID. One thing about COVID, and I think that I want to come back to this really briefly, is I don't know that the instances of COVID really correlate to the vaccinations for that. Maybe you've got better data on that. It doesn't show it in the Iowa data, but maybe you've got better information on that.
I think the Iowa data is pretty spot on. I would agree with you.
It just doesn't seem like it correlates much. Now, having said that, let's talk about the vaccinations for the other diseases that we talked about, because I think that's important, and I think it is something that we shouldn't wander by today, that we really should take a moment and talk about it and say, look, we know that we can help eliminate some of these issues from a respiratory perspective if we simply do a few things from a vaccination perspective that will help us. And flu is one, RSV is another, shingles is another, pneumonia is another, and yet it certainly seems like we don't get a whole lot of takers for that kind of stuff.
Right, yeah. Vaccinations are out there for a reason, and everybody has to make their own decisions and completely respect people's decisions, but there are, like you say, there's vaccinations to help protect not only us, but those of us around us too. If we have loved ones that are 65 and older, if we have children or grandchildren, it's not all about protecting us, it's about protecting others as well.
So let's talk a little bit about those vaccinations and how those actually work, because we know that flu typically is given in the fall, RSV typically given in the fall, and honestly, COVID probably anytime if you had a desire for that. But what about the pneumonia and the shingles shot? Because I think those two things, especially for people my age and older, so I'm almost 65, so people who are 65 and older, what are the kinds of things that we should be paying attention to when it comes to the shingles and the pneumonia shot?
So shingles, it's a virus. It's a painful disease. If you had chickenpox and that virus is already in you and it just kind of lies dormant until, there's a stressor or something that causes shingles. But there is a shingles vaccine for it. Anybody 50 and older can take the shingles vaccine to help prevent having shingles. But so if you've had chickenpox or anything like that and you have interest in the shingles vaccine, let us know and be happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything else that we should cover today, Heather, before we move on?
Just like you say, protect yourself, and by protecting yourself, you're protecting others.
Absolutely. And if anybody's got a question about vaccinations, who can we call?
You can absolutely call the clinic at 265-2700. We have Michael DeLong, who is our immunization specialist. He is well versed on the vaccinations. Give me a call. Happy to talk to anybody who has questions.
Thank you very much for your time today, Heather. Appreciate that. My guest on the podcast today has been Heather Rasmussen. Heather is the Chief Quality and Ancillary Services Officer here at CCMH. I'm Don Lintzman, your host for the Here's to Your Health podcast. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great day.